John, in applying frameworks and principles of philosophy of biology to specific areas, healthcare and medicine is one of the newer areas that philosophy of biology is making a contribution to. From your perspective of a pluralistic metaphysics and a process ontology, how can those principles be applied to medicine and healthcare?
Well, thank you. That's an interesting question. I think that the perspective from my philosophical perspective that I would most appeal to there would be the process ontology. And in a certain way, this is a kind of a very open door for me, because what is medicine? Medicine is trying to maintain the stability of a very complex process. And of course, one of the absolutely central points of process philosophy is that the stability of the more or less stable processes that are of such interest to us is not free. It's something that is constantly worked at. And of course, when it goes wrong, we have to think about how to stabilize the process. There also, I think, there are ways in which we might understand disease a little differently from a process perspective. One example that I've often used is how we should think about cancer. Actually, I heard a nice quote from a researcher on cancer recently who said, "Our ambition should be to live long enough to get cancer," which I seem to be exactly right. And so, and the way I would understand this is the question we should ask ourselves before we ask ourselves, how, why we get cancer, is why we don't get cancer. Because, cancer is a failure of something quite miraculous in a way, which is the ability over a long lifespan for the sequence of dividing cells, differentiating cells, self-terminating cells to maintain itself.
Because that's how we grew. That was involved in everything that happened in the development.
Everything.
So that's the natural process.
Yes, that's the natural process. Yeah. And that's the process that follows more or less a homeoretic pathway, to take a term from C.H. Waddington, for a process that is stabilized along a trajectory. So what happens to life cycles? We are life cycles. Organisms are life cycles. So we have this process of cell division and, as I say, differentiation and cell death that is somehow stabilized along this path. When the stabilization fails, we get a whole bunch of different things going wrong, which we call cancer, which, as I say, is improperly regulated cell division that is not properly controlled, or sometimes cell differentiation that goes wrong, and you get these bizarre cancers where you have little bits of different organs all messed together in some horrible growth. So there's, in a sense, you would think in left to itself, this is what would happen to a complex biological organism. Something would go wrong with this exquisitely stabilized process, and we call it cancer. So it explains why we should not expect there to be one cancer or one cure for cancer. So again, I think this is understood by cancer researchers now, that it's a very diverse disease, and that we shouldn't expect there to be a universal cure for it. But it's easy to see that in a process context. And it also explains why eventually, if we live long enough, we're going to get cancer. And so we should just be so lucky as to live. Of course, obviously, I don't mean to ignore the tragedies of people who have cancers very early in life. And living to 20 and getting cancer is not a desirable outcome. So I don't want to be misinterpreted on this, sure. but that that if we live to be a ripe old age, probably, if something else doesn't get us eventually, cancer will, is a pretty reliable biological generalization.
And you come to that through a process understanding.
For understanding that the human should be, like other organisms, should be understood as a life cycle stabilized with remarkably elaborate processes and activities to follow roughly a predictable trajectory.
And so the stabilization is the complex thing of how this process can be stabilized, which is what we think is the default state, but it's not the default state.
Yes, so we tend to think, if we think mechanistically, we think there's this machine, something comes along and gets in the way, and we destroy a bit of it and it goes all wrong. I mean, that is a possible perspective, but I think a more illuminating perspective is to start with to realize that if we're going to make progress with cancer, it'll probably be more through understanding how we manage to stabilize ourselves along this trajectory, rather than understanding all the different ways it can be destabilized and finding each one, a way of dealing with. Yes, of course, we're going to find certain chemicals and certain interactions that do destabilize it, cause particular cancers, and we can usefully identify those. But to really get to grips with it as a medical problem would require, if it's even possible, would require a full understanding of the whole stabilization of this trajectory over the lifespan, which is what we are, this lifespan.